Friday nights were routine. Emily's spaghetti on the table, a glass of wine in her hand, and my father, Roy, taking up space like he owned the house. I should have been used to it by now, but lately, these dinners left me with a sour taste that had nothing to do with the food. Roy was everything I wasn't: charming, confident, and magnetic. At 56, he carried himself like a man who knew he could get away with anything. Growing up as his son meant living in his shadow, constantly feeling like I wasn't enough. Over the years, I tried to let that resentment go, but having him around so much lately wasn't helping. Emily adored him. She hung on every word of his stories, laughed at his jokes, and lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It used to make me proud how she could make anyone feel welcome. Now, it just made me uncomfortable. Dinner that night was no different. Roy leaned back in his chair, recounting one of his old police stories, Emily hanging on every word. So there I was staring down this guy holding a knife, he said with a grin. I didn't even flinch. Told him, go ahead, see what happens. Emily gasped, her eyes wide. What did he do? He folded, of course, Roy said with a shrug. They always do. She laughed, and for a moment, her gaze lingered on him. Too long. I clenched my fork tighter, focusing on my plate. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed little moments like this, but tonight, it felt sharper, more deliberate. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Emily fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady. I stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of that look they'd exchanged. It was brief, but it was there, a flicker of something I couldn't name. I told myself I was imagining things, but the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Or maybe I wasn't. The unease lingered, shadowing my every move. It wasn't just that Emily was warmer around Roy. It was the small things piling up. The way she suddenly seemed more energetic on the mornings he visited. The way her laughter felt lighter, fuller, when he was around. Or the way Roy, a man who rarely called anyone, now seemed to find excuses to text her. I wanted to dismiss it all. Maybe it was just my father's natural charm. The same charm that always made me feel invisible growing up. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. One afternoon, I came home early from work to find them in the kitchen. I hadn't announced I was coming, and the way Emily froze when she saw me only added to my growing suspicion. Jack, you're home early, she said, her voice a little too chipper. Roy leaned casually against the counter, sipping coffee from one of our mugs. Hey, kiddo. Boss let you off the leash today. I ignored him, my eyes on Emily. What's going on? Nothing, she said quickly. Roy just stopped by to see my son. Roy cut in smoothly, smirking as if daring me to challenge him. What else? Emily busied herself at the sink, rinsing something that didn't need rinsing. Roy stayed where he was, too comfortable, too smug. I wanted to say something, but what? I didn't have proof of anything. Just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Later that night, I sat in the living room while Emily showered. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and without thinking, I reached for it. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Snooping felt wrong, but ignoring the pit in my stomach felt worse. The message was from Roy. Had a great time earlier. Thanks for listening. Listening to what? My chest tightened as I scrolled up, searching for context. The rest of their conversation was harmless, small talk, mostly. But there was an ease to their words, a familiarity that didn't sit right with me. When Emily came downstairs, towel drying her hair, I put the phone back quickly. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, and she didn't care. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control of something important. At work, I stared at blueprints without seeing them, my mind circling the same questions. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something going on between my wife and my father? That evening, I decided to test the waters. Emily, I said over dinner, keeping my tone light, you and Roy seem to be getting along really well lately. She glanced up, surprised. Well, yeah. I mean, he's your dad, Jack. I think it's nice we have a good relationship. Her answer was so casual, so normal, that I felt foolish for even asking. But then she added, almost absent-mindedly, he's been through a lot. Sometimes I think he just needs someone to talk to. And you're that someone? She frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said quickly, not wanting to tip my hand too soon. I just didn't realize you two were so close. She rolled her eyes, brushing it off. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I could tell it unsettled her. Good. At least now she knew I was paying attention. The turning point came a week later. Roy had come over while I was at work, a fact Emily casually mentioned over dinner, like it was no big deal. What for? I asked, trying to sound indifferent. Just to fix the leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, she said. We could have called a plumber. It wasn't a big deal, Jack. He offered. I didn't respond, but my mind was racing. Roy didn't fix things, he hired people to do that. The idea of him playing handyman for us made no sense. That night, after Emily went to bed, I set up a hidden camera in the living room. I hated myself for doing it, but I needed answers. The not knowing was eating me alive. For a few days, nothing unusual happened. I reviewed the footage obsessively, feeling more ridiculous with every uneventful clip. I started to think I was losing my mind. Then I saw it. It was mid-afternoon, 2 days later. Roy had let himself in, as he often did, and Emily greeted him with a smile. They sat on the couch talking. At first, it seemed innocent, until Roy reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just smiled. My stomach turned as I watched Roy lean in, his hand lingering on her cheek. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then closed the distance. They kissed. I stopped the video, my hands shaking. My first reaction was disbelief. Maybe I was misinterpreting what I saw. Maybe there was some explanation that would make this all make sense. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My wife, the woman I'd built a life with, had betrayed me. And my father? The man who was supposed to guide and protect me? He'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. The next morning, I left for work early. I couldn't face either of them. Not yet. But as I stared out the windshield on my drive, one thought kept looping in my head. This wasn't over. I spent the next 3 days avoiding both of them. Emily noticed, of course. She asked why I was quiet, if something was bothering me. I'd mutter excuses about work or stress, but inside, the anger boiled. Every time she touched my arm or smiled at me, I had to bite back the urge to say something, to scream at her, to tell her I knew. Roy, on the other hand, was predictable. He called me twice during those 3 days, leaving voicemails about catching up or grabbing a beer. I didn't answer. Just hearing his voice made my chest tighten with rage. But I wasn't ready to confront them, not until I had a plan. By Friday, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I left work early again, heart pounding as I drove home. The driveway was empty. Emily's car wasn't there, and neither was Roy's, but I knew they had been meeting when they thought I wouldn't notice. The hidden camera I'd set up in the living room had proven that much. Over the past 2 days, I'd seen enough footage to know this wasn't just some passing flirtation. There were stolen touches, shared whispers, and more than one kiss. Each one felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I parked and walked into the house, the silence feeling heavier than it should have. I stood in the living room for a moment, staring at the couch where they'd kissed. My hands clenched in a fist. It wasn't enough to sit back and watch anymore. I needed to do something. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. That evening, Emily came home with grocery bags in her hands, her hair pulled back and her face flushed like she'd been rushing. She smiled at me, but there was something off about it, like she was testing the waters. "Hey," she said, setting the bags on the counter. "You're home early again. Everything okay?" "Fine," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Where were you?" She froze, just for a split second, before recovering. "At the store?" "Why?" "No reason," I said, my eyes boring into hers. "What did you buy?" She faltered, glancing at the bags as if she'd forgotten what was in them. "Just stuff we needed. Eggs, milk, you know." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Did you see Roy today?" Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "What? No. Why would you?" "Stop lying, Emily," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. I could see the panic in her eyes, the gears turning as she tried to figure out how much I knew. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, but her voice wavered. I pulled out my phone and opened the video I'd saved from the camera, holding it up so she could see. Her face went pale. You're going to tell me the truth, I said, my voice shaking with anger, or I'm going to make sure everyone knows about this. Your family. My family. Everyone. Emily broke. She started crying, her shoulders shaking as she leaned against the counter for support. Jack, I'm so sorry, she whispered. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just... Spare me the excuses, I snapped. How long? A few months, she said, barely audible. A few months? I repeated, stunned. My mind reeled. This wasn't some one-time mistake. This was an affair, an actual, ongoing affair with my father. Why? I asked, my voice cracking. What the hell is wrong with you? She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I don't know. I don't know, okay? It just happened. That's not an answer, I said, stepping closer. You owe me more than that. She hesitated, then blurted, I felt lonely, Jack. You've been so distant lately. You're always at work, and when you're home, it's like you're not even here. Roy, he made me feel seen. I stared at her, barely able to process what she was saying. So your solution was to sleep with my dad? I didn't plan for this to happen, she said, her voice breaking. It just he was there, and we connected, and I didn't know how to stop it. The sound of tires crunching on the driveway made us both freeze. I turned toward the window and saw Roy's truck pulling in. You called him? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. No, she said quickly. I didn't. I swear. I didn't believe her, but it didn't matter. I was done waiting. The door opened, and Roy walked in like he owned the place. He stopped short when he saw us, his eyes darting between Emily's tear-streaked face and my clenched fists. What's going on here? He asked, feigning ignorance. You tell me, I said, my voice ice cold. I think you know exactly what's going on. Roy smirked, as if he'd already decided how this would play out. Look, Jack, I think you're overreacting. Overreacting? I cut him off, my voice rising. You've been screwing my wife, and you think I'm overreacting? Emily flinched, but Roy didn't even blink. I'm not going to apologize for something that just happened, Jack, he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. You've always been too soft. Emily deserves more than you've been giving her. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. You think you're better than me? I asked, stepping closer. You think betraying your own son makes you the bigger man? Roy shrugged, his expression smug. I think it's time you grew up and faced reality. That was it. I lunged at him, fists flying, but he caught me, his years as a cop giving him the upper hand. He shoved me back, and I stumbled, rage blinding me. Jack, stop! Emily screamed, stepping between us. Don't you dare defend him! I shouted at her. After everything you've done, don't you dare! Roy straightened his shirt, his smirk returning. You're pathetic, he said. No wonder she came to me. I wanted to hit him again, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. He wasn't worth it. None of this was. You're dead to me, I said, my voice trembling with fury. Both of you. And with that, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The cold December air hit me like a slap as I stepped out of the house. My chest heaved, my fists still clenched. I climbed into my truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was spinning, fragments of their betrayal flashing in my head. Emily's tears, Roy's smirk, his smug, dismissive tone. You're pathetic. The words echoed in my head, igniting a fire in my gut. I started the truck and drove aimlessly through the dark streets, unsure where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay there. Not in that house. Not with them. I ended up in a Walmart parking lot, sitting in the cab of my truck with the heater blasting. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I didn't look at it. I already knew who it was. Emily probably calling to beg, or Roy calling to gloat. When I finally picked up the phone, it wasn't to answer. It was to open the camera footage again. I watched the video of them kissing, my stomach twisting into knots. I couldn't believe how casual they were about it, like it was just another moment in their day. I pressed play on another clip recorded earlier that week. Roy had come over while I was at work. Emily greeted him at the door, smiling in that way she used to smile at me. You're early, she said, her voice soft. Couldn't wait. Roy replied, leaning in to kiss her. I stopped the video, all rising in my throat. It wasn't just the act itself that broke me. It was the ease of it, the comfort they seemed to share. Like I was the outsider in my own life, the fool they both pitted. I threw my phone into the passenger seat and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling of the truck. This wasn't just betrayal. This was destruction. And the worst part was I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. The next day, I called in sick to work and drove to my mother's house. My parents had divorced when I was 13, and while my relationship with my mom had always been strong, she'd never spoken fondly of Roy. She used to warn me about him, back when I still thought he was a hero. Roy doesn't love anyone but himself, Jack, she'd said once after a particularly nasty custody argument. I didn't believe her back then. Now, I wondered if she'd been right all along. She greeted me at the door with a concerned look. Jack, what's wrong? You look awful. Can I come in? She nodded and stepped aside, ushering me into the living room. We sat on the couch, and for a moment, I didn't know where to start. How do you tell your mother that your father, the man who raised you, slept with your wife? It's Roy, I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. Her expression darkened. What about him? I hesitated, then blurted it out. He's been having an affair. With Emily. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Oh my God, Jack. Are you serious? I nodded, and before I knew it, the whole story was spilling out of me. The suspicions, the camera, the footage, the confrontation. By the time I finished, my mother looked equal parts horrified and furious. I can't believe him, she said, shaking her head. Actually, no, I can believe it. I've always known Roy was selfish, but this is a new low. What do I do, Mom? I asked, my voice cracking. How do I even begin to move on from this? She reached over and took my hand. You cut them out, Jack. Both of them. You don't owe either of them a damn thing. Her words were harsh, but they made sense. Roy had already burned every bridge between us. And Emily? She'd made her choice. That night, I went back to the house. Emily was in the living room, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when I walked in, her face streaked with tears. Jack, she said, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't. Just don't. She stood up, wiping her eyes. Please, just let me explain. You've explained enough, I said, my voice cold. You were lonely. I was distant. I get it. But you could have come to me, Emily. You could have said something. Instead, you chose him. She flinched at the bitterness in my voice. I made a mistake, she said. A terrible, horrible mistake. But I love you, Jack. I want to fix this. Please, let me fix this. I laughed bitterly. You want to fix this? Then invent a time machine and undo the last few months. Otherwise, we're done. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the footage, the way she'd smiled at him, the way she'd kissed him like it was the most natural thing in the world. I'll be staying somewhere else tonight, I said, turning toward the stairs. I'll let you know when I'm coming back for my stuff. Jack, wait. But I didn't wait. I climbed the stairs, packed a bag, and left without looking back. Outside, I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the house. This was where we'd built our life together, where we'd laughed, argued, celebrated anniversaries, and planned for the future. And now it was just another thing they destroyed. As I drove away, I thought about my mom's words. You don't owe either of them a damn thing. She was right. I didn't owe them forgiveness, or understanding, or closure. All I owed them was my absence. And they'd earned it. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, awkward conversations, and a suffocating sense of loss. I stayed at a cheap, extended-stay hotel on the outskirts of town while I filed for divorce and started splitting assets with Emily. She tried to talk to me a few times, leaving tearful voicemails and long text messages about how she still loved me and how she wanted to work things out. I never responded. The damage was too deep, and no amount of apologies could fill the gaping hole she and Roy had carved into my life. My father didn't bother with apologies. The day after I left, he sent me a text. You're being dramatic, Jack. Let's talk this out like men. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to him. The news spread through our family like wildfire. My mom, never one to mince words, called Roy directly and let him have it. "You're disgusting," she told him, "and I hope you rot alone." My sister, Lisa, was furious. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she yelled at Roy during a tense phone call. "You don't sleep with your son's wife, Dad. That's not just bad parenting. It's psychotic." Roy, true to form, didn't see what the big deal was. "I didn't force anyone to do anything," he said, as if that absolved him of any guilt. Family gatherings became impossible. No one wanted Roy around, but cutting him out meant splitting the family in two. My cousins, aunts, and uncles were caught in the middle, unsure whether to take sides or pretend everything was fine. As for me, I stopped showing up to any family events altogether. I couldn't bear the thought of running into Roy or hearing someone whisper about what happened with Jack. Emily wasn't much better. She called me almost every day, her messages alternating between desperate and defensive. "Jack, please, just talk to me," one voicemail said, her voice shaking. "I know I screwed up, but we've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." Another one was angrier. "You're not innocent in this, you know. You shut me out for years, and She cut herself off, then sighed. "I don't know. Just call me back." I never did. The divorce moved quickly. We didn't have kids, and Emily didn't fight me on the terms. She agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds, though I suspected she only did it out of guilt. When the papers were finalized, she sent me one last message. "I'll always love you, Jack. I hope one day you can forgive me." I deleted it without replying. I avoided Roy for weeks, but I knew I couldn't dodge him forever. One afternoon, I drove to his house, determined to say my piece. He opened the door with a grin, as if he'd been expecting me. "Jack," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "About time you came around." I didn't move. "I'm not here to come around, Roy. I'm here to tell you what a pathetic excuse for a father you are." His grin faltered, but he recovered quickly, crossing his arms. "Look, I'm sorry things happened the way they did, but you're acting like I'm some kind of monster. Emily's an adult. She made her own choices. And you encouraged her." I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing, and you didn't care who it hurt." Roy shrugged. "I can't help it if she felt more comfortable with me than she did with you." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let him see how much they hurt. "You're a joke," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You've spent your entire life pretending to be this great guy, but all you've ever cared about is yourself." Roy's expression hardened. "You think you're better than me, Jack? You're just bitter because you couldn't keep your wife happy." I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to hit him. He wasn't worth it. None of this was. "Enjoy being alone, Roy," I said, stepping back toward my truck. "Because that's exactly what you deserve." He didn't try to stop me. Cutting Roy and Emily out of my life didn't make the pain disappear, but it was a start. I began therapy, something I'd always been too proud to consider before. "It's not about moving on overnight," my therapist said during one session. "It's about figuring out who you are without them, and who you want to be moving forward." I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, and spending late nights at the office. It wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but it kept my mind busy. On weekends, I drove to the lake where my mom lived, helping her with yard work or just sitting on the porch with her, sipping coffee and talking about anything but Roy. "You're stronger than you think, Jack," she told me one morning. "Don't let this define you." One night, months after the divorce was finalized, I sat at my desk and wrote a letter. It wasn't for Emily or Roy. It was for me. I wrote about the betrayal, the anger, and the grief. I wrote about the love I'd lost and the lessons I'd learned. And when I finished, I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, knowing I'd probably never read it again. It wasn't about closure, not really. It was about letting go. A year after everything fell apart, I moved to Denver for a fresh start. New job, new city, new life. I found a small apartment with a view of the mountains and spent my weekends hiking or exploring the city. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself instead of for someone else. The pain of what happened still lingered, but it didn't consume me anymore. One morning, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunrise, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Roy and Emily had taken a lot from me, but they hadn't taken everything. And as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, I realized I still had a future. And this time it was mine alone. The sharp mountain air of Denver became my refuge. A year had passed since the betrayal, and while the scars of what happened would always remain, the city gave me space to breathe, to figure out who I was without the weight of my marriage or my father's shadow. I worked hard, pouring my energy into my new position as a project manager for a construction firm. The days were long, but they were productive. Each blueprint, each completed structure felt like a small victory, proof that I could build something strong and lasting, even if my personal life had crumbled. The nights, though, were harder. They were quiet, too quiet sometimes. I'd sit on my balcony, staring out at the city lights, and think about what I'd lost. Emily's laughter. The easy comfort of knowing someone was waiting for me at home. Even Roy's overbearing presence, as much as I hated to admit it, left a strange void. But there was no going back, and I didn't want to. Not anymore. One evening, after a long day at work, I got a call from an unknown number. I debated ignoring it, but decided to answer. "Jack," a familiar voice said. It took me a moment to place it. "Emily?" There was a pause on the other end, and then she said, "I'm sorry for calling. I needed to talk to you." I didn't say anything, waiting for her to continue. "I know you don't want to hear from me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what I did, about what I threw away. And Stop," I said, cutting her off. My voice was calm, but firm. "Emily, I don't need an apology. Not anymore. I've moved on." Her breath hitched. "Jack, I'm not trying to get you back. I needed to tell you how sorry I am." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or sadness at hearing her voice. I felt nothing. "Okay," I said finally. "You've said it. Goodbye, Emily." I hung up and blocked the number, my heart strangely light. A few weeks later, I was grocery shopping when I saw someone I never thought I'd run into again. Roy. He was standing in the produce section, holding a bag of apples, his once commanding presence diminished. His hair was thinner, his face more lined. He looked older, weaker. He didn't see me at first, but when he turned and our eyes met, I saw the flicker of recognition. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over, his steps hesitant. "Jack," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. I didn't reply, just stared at him. "I've been meaning to call you," he said, shifting awkwardly. "I wanted to, I don't know, clear the air." "There's nothing to clear," I said. "Jack, I know I screwed up." "Screwed up?" I interrupted, my voice low but sharp. "You destroyed everything, Roy. You didn't just betray me. You showed me exactly who you are." He flinched but didn't argue. "Do you have any idea what you did to me?" I continued, my words trembling with barely controlled anger. "You didn't just take my wife. You took my trust, my family. You made me question everything I thought I knew about loyalty and love." Roy opened his mouth, then closed it, like he didn't know how to respond. "I don't want your excuses," I said, my voice steady now. "I don't want anything from you. We're done, Roy, and we always will be." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his bag of apples. For the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. That encounter marked a turning point. Letting go of the anger wasn't easy, but I realized I didn't need Roy's remorse or Emily's apologies to move forward. Their actions said everything I needed to know about them. And now, they were just part of my past. I started focusing more on the things that brought me joy. Hiking became a weekend ritual, the steady rhythm of my boots on the trail grounding me in a way nothing else could. I started taking cooking classes, laughing with strangers over failed soufflés and burnt sauces. I even made new friends, real friends who didn't know me as Jack, the guy whose wife cheated with his dad. With them, I could just be Jack. 1 year to the day after I moved to Denver, I stood on my balcony, watching the sunrise. I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the fallout. It all felt so distant now, like a story I'd heard about someone else. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the letter I'd written months ago. Unfolding it, I skimmed the words, the pain and anger practically radiating off the page. Then, without hesitation, I took a lighter and held it to the edge of the paper. The flames ate away at the letter, the ashes scattering in the cool morning breeze. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about freeing myself from it. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in gold and orange, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Roy and Emily had taken a lot from me, but they hadn't taken everything. I still had my strength, my resilience, and the life I was building for myself. For the first time in a long time, I was excited for the future. And this time, it belonged to me.